My name is Mira. I teach high school English in a small town where people still wave when they drive past and funerals close entire streets. My students call me Miss. As if that one word is enough to hold all the parts of me they don't see. The woman who writes poetry she never shares. Who irons her blouses while listening to old love songs. Who once believed that choosing someone meant they would stay chosen. The day I married Aaron was cold but clear. I remember that more than anything. The sky, too blue for January, and the wind sharp as glass. My sister fastened the last button of my dress with trembling fingers, whispering that I looked beautiful. And I lied with my smile. In the mirror, I saw a woman costumed in lace and good intentions. And I wanted to believe good intentions could hold the weight of forever. I wanted to believe the stories. That love grows in time. That duty builds affection. That silence is just a pause before the music begins again. Aaron was already waiting when I walked down the aisle. He didn't turn until I was almost beside him. That was the first moment something inside me curled in confusion. Why didn't he look? Why wasn't he watching me arrive? But I didn't let it sink. I buried that question beneath vows I didn't write, and a kiss that tasted more like nerves than promise. Our families cheered. My mother cried. And when we stood in the reception hall surrounded by centerpieces we'd argued over, and a playlist I'd made alone, I told myself this was the start of something real. It wasn't that he was cruel. Aaron never raised his voice. He always paid half. Always said thank you when I brought him coffee or folded his laundry, just the way he liked. But everything about him was at arm's length, his affections, his thoughts, his joy. I spent the first 6 months married to a man whose inner world felt locked behind glass. Sometimes he'd stare at me across the dinner table, like I was someone he'd never quite learned to read. At school, I taught my students how to dissect a novel, how to trace meaning through motifs and structure. I could help them understand Gatsby's yearning, Juliet's blind hope. But I couldn't read my own husband. I couldn't decode the way he touched me like someone fulfilling a chore, or the way he avoided eye contact when I spoke about wanting a dog, a garden, a baby. He'd nod, distracted, or offer a non-committal hum, then go back to checking his email or scrolling through the sports app on his phone. Every conversation with him felt like talking through glass, muffled and distant. At night, he fell asleep within minutes. I lay beside him in the dark, listening to his breathing settle into a rhythm that never changed, wondering how someone could rest so easily while I unraveled silently a few inches away. I memorized the ceiling, counted the ticks of the clock, and told myself again and again that this was just the beginning, that love comes later, that I simply had to be patient. But I wasn't patient. Not really. I was surviving. I was simmering. I was waiting for something to bloom in a garden where nothing had ever been planted. And somewhere deep down I think I already knew. I wasn't building a marriage. I was waiting in a room he'd never walked into. The first thing I learned after we got married was that cooking for two is lonelier than cooking for one. When I lived alone, I used to play Nina Simone and drink red wine while chopping onions barefoot, the smell of garlic warming the kitchen like a soft confession. There was no one to impress, only the quiet ritual of nourishing myself, of creating something that tasted like care. But after the wedding, the kitchen changed. It became a proving ground. I learned his preferences: no mushrooms, no spicy food, chicken breast only, never thighs. I stopped seasoning too heavily. I cooked meals that felt like compromises, plated them with precision, and set them down like fragile hopes. He'd nod. Sometimes he'd say, "Thanks, babe." Then he'd eat with the television on, half watching whatever ESPN had on, half scrolling through headlines. Most nights, the only sound between us was the clink of silverware. There was a week sometime in the early... On the first night, I held out a cutting board and asked if he wanted to help. He smiled faintly and said he'd had a long day. He retreated to the couch, phone in hand. The cutting board stayed empty. I cooked shrimp risotto alone, stirring the rice slowly, waiting for it to bloom into something creamy, something that would hold us. It didn't. We ate in silence. He finished first, wiped his mouth, and said, "Pretty good." Then he asked if we had any cookies. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask why he didn't see me, why he didn't want to try. But the words stuck like gristle in my throat, and I only nodded toward the pantry. After a while I stopped making lists. I started microwaving leftovers and eating before he got home. I told myself I preferred it that way, the freedom, the quiet, the absence of expectation. But the truth was more bitter. I was shrinking myself to fit into a marriage that never made space for me. At school I smiled. I graded essays during lunch and kept granola bars in my desk drawer. My students were loud and chaotic and startlingly tender in the way teenagers are, blurting out confessions they didn't realize were confessions. I clung to them, to the rhythm of bell schedules and lesson plans, to the way a classroom could feel full even when my home felt hollow. One afternoon, a student lingered after class. Her name was Soraya, and she always sat in the back row, hoodie pulled up, arms crossed. That day she hovered by my desk and asked. That night, I got home to find Aaron already on the couch. The dishwasher was full but not running. He looked up briefly when I walked in, then returned to his phone. I asked how his day was and he said, fine, without asking about mine. I stood there for a moment, keys still in hand, coat still zipped, and felt the weight of our silence press against my chest like a stone. I didn't cry. Not yet. That would come later. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, reheated leftover stew, and ate alone at the counter. The dishwasher stayed full. The silence stayed sharp. And I realized something else. When no one notices your effort, it starts to feel like a mistake. It was late January when I started sitting on the porch again. Not in the way people do during summer evenings, barefoot with a glass of something sweet, but wrapped in 2 coats, a scarf, and gloves so thick I could barely hold my tea. I went out after dinner, or after whatever passed for dinner those days. Our mailbox leaned slightly to the left, and I made a mental note to fix it. I wouldn't. But out there in the sharp cold I could feel my own pulse again. I could see it, even clouds of breath that proved I was still here. One night the wind carried the scent of someone's fireplace. Dry pine and smoke, sharp and nostalgic. It hit me like grief. Not for a person but for a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. I closed my eyes and saw myself at 23, spinning in the kitchen of my first apartment, singing off-key with a spoon in one hand and a wine glass in the other. That girl was messy and bright and foolishly full of hope. She thought marriage was a destination, not a gamble. She wouldn't have stayed this long. But I had. I stayed because I thought leaving would make me a failure. I stayed because I believed the problem was mine to fix. That if I just became softer, more patient, more understanding, maybe he would turn toward me. Maybe he would finally look. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. Not my mother, who would have frowned and quoted something about loyalty. Not my friends, who all seemed happily entangled in their own partnerships. And certainly not my sister, whose own divorce had turned her into a kind of skeptic. Tender, yes, but also watchful. She would have seen right through me. Not with judgment, but that quiet knowing that makes hiding pointless. One night, as I sat watching the frost creep across the railing, Aaron opened the front door. Just stood there in his socks, peering out like I was a raccoon rustling in the trash. You okay? He asked, voice flat. I'm fine, I said. Just thinking. He nodded, lingered 1 second too long, then shut the door. The sound of it closing behind him felt louder than it should have. That's when I realized. He wasn't coming out to join me. He was just making sure I wasn't planning to disappear. The next day, I arrived at school early and sat in my car for 15 minutes before going in. I watched students filter past, shoulders hunched against the wind, faces still soft from sleep. One boy walked with a girl, their arms brushing. She laughed at something he said, then reached up to fix the edge of his hood. It was such a small thing, tender, thoughtless, but it gutted me. That evening, I stayed out on the porch even after the tea went cold. My fingers ached. My nose burned. Still I didn't move. I told myself I was waiting for something. A moment, a sign, a shift in the air. But maybe I was just sitting with the truth for the first time. Not wrestling it. Not outrunning it. Just letting it settle. I wasn't happy. I wasn't even numb anymore. I was hungry. For touch, for conversation. For someone who would notice the way I always folded the towels just so. Or how I cried during commercials with dogs in them. I was starving for intimacy, not sex, but the kind of closeness that makes you feel seen. Eventually I stood up. My body creaked in protest. As I turned to go back inside, I whispered to the wind. Not loud enough for anyone to hear, but loud enough for myself. I can't do this much longer. And the door, when I opened it, made no sound at all. I left on a Thursday. No drama. No flurry of packed bags or shattered plates. Just a quiet, deliberate exit. The kind people mistake for weakness. But I knew what I was doing. I waited until he left for work, folded a few clothes into a canvas tote, and drove to my sister's house 3 towns over. I didn't leave a note. I didn't lock the door. I just left. Not because I had a plan, but because staying had become its own kind of death. Nora opened the door still holding a spoon and half a bowl of cereal. She didn't ask why I was there. She just blinked twice, stepped aside and said, "You want coffee? That's how you know someone loves you. They ask nothing until you're ready." Her apartment smelled like rosemary and dryer sheets. She lived above a florist and kept candles burning even when she wasn't home. I settled onto her faded blue couch, the one we used to cram onto during college breaks, watching bad movies and talking about nothing until morning. She tossed a blanket over my lap and returned with a chipped mug. I held it like an anchor. That first day, I said almost nothing. I stared at her bookshelf, at a framed photo of us in matching dresses as flower girls, and wondered how many versions of me she'd seen, how many times I'd started over in her presence. "I brought the wedding album," I said quietly, "but I left it in the car." "You don't need it," she replied, "unless you want to burn it. In which case, I'll get the matches." I laughed, sudden and hoarse, and then I cried, not the pretty kind. I wept into her sleeve, shoulders shaking, nose running, the whole mess. She held me the way only an older sister can, firm and steady, like she'd been expecting the collapse all along and had simply been waiting for me to land. Over the next few days I began to thaw. I slept late, drank coffee from oversized mugs, and let Nora's dog curl beside me on the couch like a breathing, furred apology. She played me old records. She made grilled cheese with tomato soup and never asked about Aaron. She only asked about me. "You look lighter," she said one morning, watching me butter toast. "And tired. But the good kind." I wanted to believe her. But my body still buzzed with the aftershock of departure. Every time my phone vibrated, I flinched. The first message from Aaron was exactly what I'd expected. "Where are you?" No question mark. No softness. Then, a few hours later, "You're really doing this?" And finally, 2 days after silence, "You said you'd never quit on us." That one stayed with me. I read it over and over like it might reveal something softer. But it was all accusation, no introspection. No. "Are you okay?" No. "I'm sorry." Just the echo of a man who believed endurance was the same as effort. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't want to, but because I'd spent so long answering to someone who never truly asked. This time I let the silence speak for me. Nora took me on drives when I couldn't sleep, windows down, radio low, the kind of aimless wandering that feels like floating. Once we stopped at a 24-hour diner and split a slice of lemon meringue pie. I told her about the cold dinners, the porch nights, the growing space between me and the life I tried so hard to fill. "I don't know what I'm doing," I confessed. "You're grieving," she said. "That's something." And she was right. I wasn't free. Not yet. I was still tethered to the idea of what we could have been, what I tried to build with my bare hands. But I was no longer pretending. And that, in itself, felt like breath. The couch became my small kingdom. I read again. Novels, essays, anything that reminded me of how words could still comfort. I wrote in a journal I hadn't touched in years. On the third night, I scribbled a single sentence and circled it twice. "I want a life that sees me." The next morning, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. Unwashed hair, sleep lines across my cheek, eyes swollen from crying. And I saw a woman coming back into her skin. Not healed, not whole, but present. And when Nora passed by and saw me staring at my reflection, she paused, then said softly, "Hey, you're still in there." I nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." The day I filed for separation, it rained so hard I had to pull over twice just to see the road. Nora offered to drive, but I told her no, I needed to do it alone. There was something about gripping the wheel with wet palms, about walking into the county clerk's office with damp hair and trembling hands, that made the whole thing feel appropriately undignified. I didn't want grace. I wanted honesty. The woman behind the desk didn't flinch. She slid the paperwork toward me like it was a menu, and I wondered how many broken hearts she saw in a day. I imagined her going home, pouring wine, and scrubbing the sadness of strangers off her skin. When she asked for my name, I gave it slowly, each syllable tasting like a bruise. Mira Calloway. Still Calloway for now. Back in the car. I sat with the engine off, rain hammering the roof, documents in my lap. There was no ceremony to it. No closure. Just ink on paper, and a dawning awareness that I'd just made myself a villain in someone else's story. Aaron wouldn't see it as a liberation. He'd see it as betrayal. And the world, our world, would echo him. The first ripple came through my mother, of course. She called the next morning, voice tight with politeness. I heard, she said. I didn't ask how. She always heard. I just wish you would have talked to us before making such a permanent decision. There it was. Not anger. Worse, disappointment varnished in concern. I did talk, I said quietly. You just didn't listen. There was a pause. Then she sighed. The kind of sigh that meant this conversation would not end in resolution. You know what people are going to think. I almost laughed. They already think it. By the end of the week, the family texts thinned out. A few cousins unfollowed me. One aunt sent me a devotional about forgiveness, the kind with watercolor flowers and a barely veiled message. Go back. Try harder. Aaron's narrative spread faster than mine ever could. That I left with no warning. That I was unhappy and selfish. That I didn't even fight for it. People believed him. Or they didn't care enough to ask. Only a few friends reached out. One left a voicemail I still haven't listened to. Another, Jenna from college, sent me a single text. Just so you know, I see you. And I believe you. That message kept me breathing some nights. At school, word traveled slower. Most of my colleagues didn't ask. But they looked at me differently. Like a cup with a chip in it. The students, mercifully, didn't notice or care. They still passed notes, still asked for extra credit, still argued about Steinbeck. And for a while, the classroom was the only place I didn't feel defined by what I had undone. Aaron and I communicated only through short texts, logistical, cold. I'll come by Saturday for my things. What about the electric bill? You still want the couch? We were splitting a life that barely held us. Divvying objects that had never felt shared. He took the air fryer and the bookshelf. I kept the blue kettle and the framed quote from Rilke that no longer felt comforting. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. I kept going. The worst part wasn't losing him. It was watching the rest of my world recalibrate in response to my absence. Friends who had once praised my strength now looked away in social gatherings. His mother unfriended me. My father called once just to say, "Your mother's having a hard time with this." As if I wasn't. And through it all, the guilt roared. Not because I regretted leaving, but because I hadn't fully grasped the cost. I thought I was saving myself from emotional extinction, and I was, but I hadn't expected the explosion to catch everyone else in the fallout. I walked through weeks with a kind of numbness I didn't recognize. I forgot to eat, forgot to wash my hair, forgot birthdays. One morning, I caught myself saying "we" out loud while writing an email. I deleted the word, backspaced until it vanished completely, and sat staring at the screen. There was no "we" anymore. Just me, Mira Calloway. And for the first time, I began to wonder, who the hell is that? We agreed on joint custody. Or rather, we accepted it because neither of us had the fight left to argue. Our daughter Sophie was 6, old enough to ask questions, too young to understand the answers. She had my hands in his eyes, and the first time I packed her overnight bag for errands, I folded her pajamas like they were breakable. The exchange happened in a parking lot. Neutral ground. A grocery store halfway between our old house and Nora's apartment. Sophie ran to him without hesitation, clutching her stuffed fox, waving back at me with her free hand. He lifted her into the car, buckled her in, and nodded once in my direction. Not angry, just mechanical. The silence between us was louder than any scream. At first, I tried to make the most of the childless weekends. Long baths, thrift store novels, late-night movies with Nora. But nothing filled the space Sophie left. Her absence echoed. Her empty shoes by the door made me cry. I started talking to her toys, dusting her bookshelf twice a week, and leaving her drawings on the fridge like she might come home and ask why they weren't there. When she was with me, I tried too hard. I packed our days with crafts, picnics, and themed pancakes shaped like animals she never asked for. I bought her new books, then read them aloud in funny voices until my throat hurt. I was desperate to prove to her, to myself, that leaving hadn't broken me. That I could still be her mother, whole and steady, even while shattered. One night as I tucked her in, she asked, "Why can't Daddy stay here too?" I froze. How do you explain emotional neglect to a child who still believes monsters live in closets? I kissed her forehead. Because Mommy and Daddy are better when we have our own houses. But we both love you the same. Always. She blinked at me quiet, then said, "Okay," and turned over, hugging her fox like it held all the answers I didn't. The guilt never left. It sat in my stomach like gravel. Every scraped knee I didn't see. Every school project he helped with while I watched from a distance. When she cried on the phone because she missed me, I told her stories about the moon. How it's always watching, even when you can't see it. How it pulls the ocean and lights the night and never really leaves. She liked that. Started calling me Moon Mama. It made me laugh then ache. I knew Aaron loved her. In his way. He was never cruel to her. He built Lego sets with her, bought her sparkly shoes, and remembered her favorite yogurt. But I also knew the version of him she saw wasn't the one I'd lived with. He was better with her than he'd been with me. And that was both a relief and a small kind of heartbreak. Once during drop-off, Sophie ran back to hug me twice. He stood waiting by the car, arms crossed, gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. When she finally climbed in, I looked at him and said, "She's okay, right? She's happy." He met my eyes. For the first time in months. "Yeah, she's good." It should have comforted me. It didn't. Not really. Because I knew what it cost to be good in his world. The quiet resignation, the unspoken needs, the shrinking. I prayed every night that she'd grow up bold. That she'd ask for what she needed. That she'd never learn to love someone by disappearing first. Nora watched me unravel in slow motion. Helped me tape drawings back onto the fridge. Handed me tissues during custody exchanges. Let me cry on her lap when Sophie's voice came through the phone too small and far away. "You're doing enough," she said once gently. "I want to do more." "You are doing more. Just not all at once." That was the thing no one tells you. Shared custody isn't a division. It's a dilution. Of time, of presence, of self. You become a parent in fragments. A lullaby in one house, a bedtime story in another. You leave love in bags, in notes, in favorite socks, hoping it carries. And still I stayed steady. Not perfect. Not even whole. But steady. Because I didn't leave my daughter. I left a silence I couldn't raise her inside. And every time she laughed big, full-bellied, unburdened, I knew I'd chosen right. There was no sudden blooming. No grand gesture or cinematic rebound. Just the quiet accumulation of small good days. The kind that pass without announcement, only revealing their importance in hindsight. Healing didn't arrive like a miracle. It showed up in pieces. A new bookshelf I built myself, pancakes made without performance, Sophie's drawings taped to walls that finally felt like mine. By then, I had moved out of Nora's place. I found a small duplex on the east edge of town, nestled between a dentist office and a dog groomer. The rent was manageable. The windows faced the morning sun. It smelled like new paint and potential. Sophie called it the cozy house. And I didn't correct her. Even when the heater rattled and the faucet leaked, it was ours. I saw someone new eventually. I didn't mean to. His name was Eli and he worked at the hardware store down the street. The first time we met, I was hunting for screws to fix a crooked table leg. He walked me through 3 aisles, handed me a small plastic bag and said, "These should do it. But if they don't, come back and yell at me." I didn't come back to yell. I came back for a plant I didn't need. Then twine. Then paint samples I never used. He never pushed. Just smiled and asked about my day in a way that didn't feel like routine. The first time I told him I had a daughter, he didn't flinch. "Cool," he said. "What's her favorite dinosaur?" I blinked. Triceratops." "Excellent choice," he nodded. "Horned and underestimated." He wasn't flashy.
No flowers. No poems.
Just small things, remembered details, unspoken kindness. He brought coffee when I forgot breakfast, held Sophie's drawings like museum pieces, and once showed up at my door with a step stool because he'd noticed me straining to reach the top shelf. It was the kind of love that didn't rush to announce itself. It just showed up, again and again, until I began to trust that maybe not everyone leaves. I didn't fall hard. I fell slowly. With suspicion and pauses and nights where I pulled away just to make sure I could. "I'm not great at this," I told him once, after flinching at a gesture too kind to be casual. Okay, he said. I'll wait. Not I'll fix you. Not I'll convince you. Just wait. Sophie liked him. But cautiously. She watched the way he carried himself around me, how he never tried too hard. Never took her hand without asking first. One night as I tucked her in, she whispered, "Do you love him?" I hesitated. "I don't know yet." She nodded like that was fine. He laughs at my knock-knock jokes. That's a good sign. We didn't rush. For a long time, Eli and I remained parallel. Meals, walks, conversations that always ended with me in my own bed. Lights out, heart racing at the slow possibility of safety. When I kissed him for the first time, it wasn't fireworks. It was quieter. Like a room where the hum of a refrigerator stops, and you suddenly realize how loud it had been. His hand on the back of my neck was gentle, grounding. I'm scared, I admitted, forehead against his. I know, he said. I am too. Love didn't fix me. It didn't erase the ache of everything I'd walked through, but it softened the edges. It reminded me I could laugh and be seen and fall asleep with someone's hand in mine without bracing for the withdrawal. The first time I called Eli in the middle of the night. A flat tire, rain, Sophie asleep in the back seat. He showed up faster than I thought possible. No questions. Just a flashlight and a spare. His hands already slick with mud before I could apologize. You okay? He asked, crouched beside the tire. Yeah, I whispered. I just didn't know who else to call. He stood, wiped his hands, and looked at me in that quiet way of his. You called the right person. I believed him. Not all at once, but enough to breathe easier the next day. That's what soft love does. It doesn't demand. It stays. I wrote the letter late on a Sunday night. Sophie was asleep in the next room, Eli gone home hours before, the house humming its usual nocturnes, the creak of pipes, the distant bark of a dog, the faint tap of tree branches against the roof. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold and an old yellow legal pad that still carried the faint smell of Nora's basement. It wasn't planned. Just began. Dear Aaron, it started like that. Not hey, not hi. Just his name.
Familiar.
Distant. I didn't write to apologize. I didn't write to accuse. I wrote because there were things I'd carried too long, things that had hardened inside me like old bones. And something about putting them on paper felt like an exhale I hadn't let myself take. I told him the truth. That I loved him once, or thought I did. That I tried every day to make our life something worth coming home to. That the silence between us wasn't always his fault. Sometimes it was mine, born of fear and resentment, and the exhaustion of never being quite enough. I wrote about the dinners, the porch nights, the way I waited for him to turn toward me and he never did. I wrote about the way I shrank, about the version of myself that died slowly, politely, in the presence of his indifference. I didn't spare myself. I named the ways I failed too. How I stopped asking, how I let anger settle like dust, how I blamed him for not reading needs I never spoke aloud. I wrote about the shame I carried after I left, the quiet fury of being called selfish for finally choosing to breathe. And then I wrote about Sophie, about how she's thriving, curious, fierce, tender, about how she draws pictures of our family with 2 houses and smiles on every face, about how she told me once, unprompted, that she's glad I'm not sad anymore. That one sentence felt like proof I hadn't destroyed her world. I'd simply rebuilt it with more windows. I told him I hope he's okay, that I don't hate him, that I hope someday he finds a kind of love that softens him, that teaches him how to reach instead of retreat. I didn't say I forgave him. That word still felt too clean for what we'd lived through. But I did say this. I've stopped holding you in my mouth like a wound. I signed it without flourish. Mira, and then I folded it. Slid it into an envelope. Wrote his name on the front in small, careful letters. I didn't send it. I never intended to. That was never the point. Instead, I placed it in a small box at the back of my closet, beside a dried flower from my wedding bouquet, Sophie's first onesie, and the broken necklace I wore on our 5th anniversary. Artifacts of a life that mattered, even if it didn't last. I went to bed that night lighter than I'd felt in years. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like breath. Sophie turned in her sleep, and mumbled something soft. And I lay there, eyes closed, heart steady, knowing that some endings don't need to be loud to be true. Some endings are just releases. And some love, even the kind that fails, teaches you how to choose yourself gently for the first time. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever stood at the edge of leaving or returning, breaking or rebuilding, I hope you know you're not alone. Share this with someone who might need the reminder that choosing yourself isn't selfish, and healing doesn't have to look heroic to be real. See you soon in the next story.